Welcome to Lecture 9, Attitude Change, Perception. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall attempt to discuss how attitude change takes place through the process of persuasion. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to know 1. The process of attitude change, how persuasive communication can change attitude. Content. Attitudes can change for a number of reasons. It is a key interest of psychologists, advertisers, and more to understand what makes people change their beliefs or opinions. Attitudes most commonly change in response to social influence. What other people do or say can have a huge effect on our own cognitions. The whole advertising industry functions on the knowledge that people's attitudes towards products or services can be molded through the use of imagery and/or sound. There are certain conditions that must exist for a person's attitude to change. Cards, 1960. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a complex theory that explains the discomfort people feel when they hold two conflicting ideas in their head at the same time, and the subsequent cognitions and resolutions that can occur from such discomfort. Attitudes can sometimes change when people behave inconsistently or out of line with the way they normally will behave, and they are unable to find external justification for such behavior. Cognitive dissonance usually occurs when a person does something that goes against the image they have of themselves, and they are unable to blame their behavior on external circumstances. So it is essentially dissonance that can cause attitude changes. Persuasive communications. To make wide-scale changes and convince a lot of people to have a certain attitude about something is very difficult. This is a problem that doctors, politicians, lawyers, and other professionals have when trying to get others to share their view. One way that mass change can be orchestrated is through the use of persuasive communication. Persuasive communication is a speech, television ad, or some kind of communication that advocates a particular side of an issue. Many persuasive communications fail to change attitudes, while some are successful. There are an infinite number of tactics that can be used when making an argument. Psychological studies have been conducted to try and understand what makes a persuasive communication effective. Aroxin et al., 2006. Yale Attitude Change. Created by researchers at Yale University. This is a method of studying persuasive communications. It involves analyzing who is making the communication, the quality of the communication, and what kind of people the communication is intended for. This method of study has produced a lot of information about what makes people's attitudes to change, but it is not perfect. What the Yale attitude change approach fails to do is say which aspects of a persuasive communication are most important than other aspects. For instance, are the arguments made in the communication more important than the person who is making the argument, or vice versa? Elaboration likelihood model. The problems with the Yale attitude change approach have been addressed by various researchers. One approach is called the elaboration likelihood model, which explains two ways in which persuasive communication can cause attitudinal change. Centrally, when a person is motivated and pays attention to the persuasive communication, they are being centrally affected. Peripherally, when a person doesn't pay attention to the argument in the speech, but is influenced by other aspects of the communication, such as who is giving it, then they are being peripherally affected. This theory says that people who are compelled or motivated enough will pay attention to the persuasive communication, analyzing its arguments in their heads long after they've heard the message. This is called the central route to persuasion. People are likely to take this route when they have their little distracting them and they are truly interested in what the persuasive communication has to say. Those who aren't motivated to pay attention to the argument, but are interested in the surface characteristics of a message, will not have an attitude change because of logic, but rather because of superficial aspects. This is called the peripheral route to persuasion. If people are not interested in the argument, they will take this shortcut and pay attention to things beside the argument, such as whether or not the person making the argument is prestigious. Some people have a need for cognition, meaning that their personality is one that demands engaging and mind-activating activities. Those with the need for cognition are much more likely to take the central route to persuasion, since they like mulling over arguments and facts to reach their conclusions. Long-lasting attitude change. Both the central and peripheral routes to persuasion would mean little if they didn't leave some kind of lasting change on a person's attitudes. Studies show that those who base their attitudes on the argument are more likely to keep their attitudes for a long time, behave in accordance to those attitudes, and more resistant to counter-persuasion. Those who take the peripheral route to persuasion which quickly lose their newfound attitudes and hardly ever behave in accordance to them. This is because the attitudes formed through peripheral routes are often based on fluff that doesn't mean much to the person and therefore doesn't leave a lasting impression. Playing to emotions. To make a persuasive argument, it is helpful to create a communication that plays to the emotions of others. Fear-arousing communication. A common tactic used when attempting to influence opinion is to scare people with fear-arousing communications. Examples of such communications are the advertisements made by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, which often portray the horrific consequences drugs can have on people's lives. By stirring up people's fears, these communications hope to imprint imagery or ideas in the mind that will keep people away from drugs. Fear-arousing communications work best when the speech or advertisement instills the fear, but then explains how to avoid or reduce such fear. If the advertisement simply causes fear but doesn't offer information on how to avoid it, then people would likely dismiss the purpose of the communication. It is also important that fear-arousing communications do not overwhelm people. Heuristic systematic model of persuasion, Aronson E. 2006. Emotions can act as a signal for how we feel about something. The heuristic systematic model of persuasion says that people will either use mental shortcuts or will systematically process the merits of something when they are forming an attitude. Heuristics are mental shortcuts people use so they can make judgments with little time needed for analyzing. If someone sees an advertisement on TV telling them to drink alcohol responsibly, then they might conjure up a heuristic or a simple rule to decide what their attitude towards the message is. They might quickly think responsibility is overrated. This allows them to disregard the advertisement with little thought. If they decide to process the argument in their head for a while, weighing the good with the bad, then they might reach a different conclusion and think, yeah, responsibility is important. Maybe I should cut back on the amount of alcohol I drink during the weekends. Choosing a base. Some advertisements might work better on certain people, but flat on others. As mentioned earlier, there are three kinds of attitudes: behavioral, cognitive, and affective. Studies have shown that advertisements are most effective when they target a person's attitude. If someone has an affectively based attitude, then the advertisement will work better on that person, will play to the emotion. If one had a cognitively based attitude, that an advertisement that lists facts will be most persuasive. Advertisers must therefore design their ads so that it affects the majority of the people. To do this, the advertiser should decide if the product or service they are promoting has people with cognitively, behaviorally, or affectively based attitudes and go from there. Resisting persuasive communications. Obviously, people are able to resist advertisements, pitches, and so on, since it would be impossible to accept everything and anything they ever hear and see. But exactly how do people manage to resist persuasive messages? Attitude inoculation. If people expose themselves to alternative viewpoints on a subject, then it will be much easier for them to fend off persuasive communications. By reading up on or making sure they see other sides of an argument, then they will be able to fight any attempts people. This tactic is called attitude inoculation. Product placement awareness. Companies will pay to have television shows, movies, video games, and so on somehow incorporate their product into the script or scenery. This is called product placement. As long as people keep in mind the fact that their entertainment may incorporate things to try and manipulate their behaviors and attitudes, the easier they find it to notice such product placements for what they really are: advertisements. Staying aware is key. Peer pressure resistance. Peer pressure is an age-old problem in which people, especially when they are young, are susceptible to trying new and potentially dangerous things because their friends or peers urge them to. People will sometimes do things they normally wouldn't so they can appear cool in front of others and be socially accepted. Adolescents can find themselves smoking, drinking, doing drugs, or having unprotected sex because the people they hang out with believe such behavior is fun, cool, and mature. It seems that the most effective way to resist peer pressure is to give people practice at turning down negative influences. Once they have experienced a mock incident and successfully rejected peers, then the more likely they will be able to use such a response should a real peer pressure incident occur. Stereotype threat. Advertisements also carry with them the possibility of feeling a stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is defined as the apprehension experienced by members of a group because they worry that their behavior might confirm a cultural stereotype. When people are thinking about the negative stereotypes surrounding whatever group they feel they belong to, it can hurt their ability to perform and do well. For instance, white people might believe that Asians are better at math. If a white person is reminded that many smart Asians will be taking the test with them, then their test scores are more likely to go down than if they were not reminded. Similarly, women do worse on tests after they've seen a commercial that depicts women in a stereotypical way. In this way, advertising that conveys negative stereotypes can severely change the attitudes of the people who view them. Conclusion. In summary, we have taken a brief look at what attitudes are and the ways they can be changed. The importance of attitudes on society cannot be overestimated. We are living in a very important time in human history where people are witnessing more and more advertisements and persuasive communications than ever before. It will be very interesting to see how so many different viewpoints are able to successfully mingle, and which values or norms win over the others. Summary. The students have learnt the following. There are certain conditions that must exist for a person's attitude to change: cognitive dissonance, counter-attitudinal advocacy, real attitude change, elaboration likelihood model. End of lecture 9. Thanks for listening.